What would you do if you were a pregnant homeless woman with only $10 and your last desperate decision uncovered a forgotten railroad boxcar hiding a secret buried for 30 years? Inside wasn't just a shocking discovery. It was evidence of a betrayal that stole the lives, wages, and dignity of hundreds of innocent families. But what happened next transformed an abandoned ghost town into a symbol of hope. Stay with me, because the truth hidden inside that boxcar changed history forever, and if you leave now, you'll miss the moment that proves one act of courage can rewrite countless lives. There are moments in life when a single door closes, and everything you thought you knew disappears forever. For Clara Bennett, that moment came on a bitter autumn morning when she was 24 years old and 7 months pregnant. She wasn't running from a war. She wasn't escaping a natural disaster. She was being abandoned by the only family she had left. The heavy oak door behind her slammed shut with a sound she would never forget. Not because it was loud, but because it sounded exactly like the end of her old life. Standing alone on the front steps, Clara instinctively wrapped one hand around the gentle curve of her swollen belly, while the other tightened around the worn leather handle of a single suitcase. Inside that suitcase were only a few dresses, her late mother's silver locket, and a small blacksmith's hammer wrapped carefully in faded oilcloth. That hammer was worthless to everyone else. To Clara, it was her father. It was every lesson he had ever whispered across the glow of a forge. It was every promise that honest work mattered. It was the last piece of home she still possessed. Inside the house, her uncle Gerald Whitmore returned calmly to his desk. To him, nothing remarkable had happened. He had simply balanced another account. 4 years earlier, after Clara's father died from a lung disease brought on by decades of working beside blazing furnaces, Gerald had taken her into his elegant home not out of love, but out of obligation. Love had never appeared on one of Gerald Whitmore's balance sheets. Everything in his world had a price. Land, buildings, businesses, people, even family. That morning, he had placed an itemized invoice in front of his pregnant niece. Every loaf of bread, every blanket, every dress, every dollar he claimed to have spent raising her. The total was impossible. A debt designed to ensure she would never argue. Then he slid 2 $5 bills across the polished desk. Take the money, leave, and don't come back. No birthday wishes. No concern for the child she carried. No goodbye. Just another transaction completed. Clara never begged. She never cried. Some pain is too deep to escape through tears. She simply picked up the $10, placed the old hammer carefully back into her suitcase, and walked away from everything she had ever known. She had no home, no husband, no parents, no friends waiting for her. Only an unborn child whose tiny heartbeat reminded her that giving up was no longer an option. She didn't yet know where she would sleep that night. She didn't know how she would find food tomorrow. She didn't even know whether she would survive the coming winter. But fate sometimes hides its greatest miracles inside its cruelest moments. Within a few days, Clara would arrive in the empty Wyoming high country, where an abandoned railroad siding had been forgotten by almost everyone alive. There, surrounded by rusting steel and broken dreams, she would make a decision so unbelievable that people would laugh in her face. With only $10 to her name, she would spend 4 of them on a sealed railroad boxcar no one wanted. A giant iron coffin left untouched for 30 years. Men twice her age called her foolish. Some pitied the pregnant woman. Others simply shook their heads and walked away. After all, who would waste nearly half of their entire fortune on a rusted boxcar that couldn't even be opened? But here's what no one, not the auctioneer, not the railroad workers, not even Clara herself could possibly have imagined. Behind that welded steel door waited a secret that had been buried for 3 decades. A secret powerful enough to expose one of the greatest betrayals in railroad history. A fortune that had never reached the workers who earned it. A dead man's final act of courage, and evidence capable of destroying the very man who had thrown a pregnant woman into the streets without a second thought. What Clara believed was the worst decision of her life would become the one choice that changed thousands of lives forever. And if she had walked away from that forgotten boxcar, none of what came next would ever have happened. The train carried Clara farther west than she had ever imagined possible. With every mile, the comfortable towns disappeared behind her, replaced by endless stretches of prairie where the wind never seemed to stop blowing. Golden grass rippled beneath a sky so enormous it made a person feel painfully small. She sat silently beside the dusty window, one hand resting over her unborn child. Every few minutes the baby kicked. Each tiny movement reminded her she was no longer making decisions for herself, alone. She whispered softly, almost too quietly to hear. "I don't know where we're going, but I promise you we'll find somewhere to belong." No one answered, only the endless rhythm of steel wheels striking the rails. Click! Clack! Click! Clack! It sounded almost like a heartbeat, counting down toward something neither she nor anyone else could yet understand. As passengers stepped off at one lonely station after another, the train grew emptier. Families disappeared. Traveling salesmen left. Cowboys collected their bags and vanished into distant ranches. By the second afternoon, Clara was nearly alone in the passenger car. That was when she overheard two railroad workers talking near the baggage compartment. "You hear they're auctioning off the old equipment at Caldera Spur?" "Yeah." "Mostly scrap? Broken rails, old boxcars, junk nobody wants." One of them laughed. "They've even got one sealed freight car sitting there. Been locked up almost 30 years. Probably full of rats." The other shrugged. "Scrap metal's worth more than whatever's inside." The conversation lasted less than a minute. But for Clara, it changed everything. She lowered her eyes to the $10 folded carefully inside her purse. $10? That was the total value of her future. Or so everyone believed. Her father had once told her something she never forgot. Real value isn't decided by what people say something is worth. It's discovered by the person willing to look closer. She looked once more at the empty planes rushing past the window. What waited for her in the town printed on her ticket. Nothing. No family. No work. No home. Nothing but another place where she would be a poor, pregnant stranger. Then another thought quietly entered her mind. What if, instead of following the path someone else had chosen, she chose her own? The decision came so suddenly that even she couldn't explain it. When the conductor walked through the nearly empty car checking tickets, Clara stood. "I'd like to get off at Caldera Spur." The conductor frowned. "You sure? There isn't a town there anymore. No hotel? No doctor? No stores? Nothing but abandoned railroad property." His eyes drifted to her swollen belly. Concern replaced surprise. "Ma'am, that's no place for a woman in your condition." For a brief moment, fear almost changed her mind. She imagined spending another freezing night alone. She imagined going into labor with no one nearby. She imagined every terrible possibility. Then her baby kicked again. Not violently. Just enough to remind her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. Sometimes it was walking forward while terrified. She smiled faintly. "I'm sure." The conductor hesitated. "Finally," he sighed. "Your life." A few minutes later, the train slowed beside an abandoned siding, barely visible beneath years of weeds. A weathered wooden sign leaned crooked beside the tracks. Caldera Spur. The letters were faded, almost beyond recognition. The brakeman lowered her suitcase onto the dirt. Then he offered his hand to help her step down. You still have time to change your mind. Clara looked across the empty landscape. Broken buildings, collapsed roofs, rusting rails stretching into nowhere, a place forgotten by almost everyone. No, she answered softly. I think this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. The train whistle echoed across the valley. Moments later, it disappeared beyond the hills, leaving only silence. A silence so complete Clara could hear the wind moving through the sagebrush. She stood completely alone. 24 years old, 7 months pregnant. $10! One suitcase. No plan. No destination. Only faith. As she slowly walked toward the abandoned rail yard, she noticed a small crowd gathered around an auctioneer selling rusted railroad equipment. Old rails, broken wagons, discarded tools, pieces of history everyone was eager to forget. Then, she saw it. At the very end of the siding sat a massive railroad boxcar. Its faded red paint had almost vanished beneath rust. The heavy sliding door wasn't merely locked. It had been welded shut. Someone had wanted to make absolutely certain it would never be opened again. Most people glanced at it for only a second before looking away. Clara couldn't. Something about that forgotten boxcar pulled at her in a way she couldn't explain. The closer she walked, the stronger that feeling became. She rested one hand gently against the cold iron wall. Inside, she heard nothing. No movement. No sound. Only decades of silence. Then the auctioneer shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. Next lot, one sealed railroad boxcar. Contents unknown. We'll start the bidding at $4. The crowd laughed. No one raised a hand. No one wanted it. Everyone believed it was worthless. Everyone. Except one pregnant young woman who had already lost everything. And in the next few seconds, she would make the $4 decision that would change her life forever. Clara couldn't explain why she did it. Every ounce of common sense told her to walk away. She was 7 months pregnant. She had only $6 left after buying the abandoned railroad boxcar. She had no roof over her head. No guarantee of food. No guarantee she and her unborn child would even survive the coming winter. Yet every time she looked at the welded steel door, she felt as though someone on the other side was still waiting. Not for rescue, for justice. The first night, she slept inside an abandoned boarding house whose broken windows barely kept out the freezing Wyoming wind. Every gust rattled the loose boards, making it sound as if ghosts still wandered the forgotten town. She barely slept. Her back ached. Her feet were swollen. Every movement reminded her that carrying a child while fighting to survive was a battle few people would ever understand. The next morning, she returned to the boxcar. She carefully examined every inch of the thick iron door. The weld wasn't ordinary. It hadn't been sealed by time. It had been sealed by human hands. Deliberately. Whoever had closed it had wanted to make certain no one would ever look inside again. That realization sent a chill through her body. Later that afternoon, an elderly railroad worker slowly approached. His name was Jedediah Cole, one of the last living men who had helped build the original railway decades earlier. His weathered face carried the weight of a lifetime. "So," he said quietly, "you're the young woman everyone keeps talking about." Clara smiled politely. "I suppose I am." He looked at her swollen belly before studying the massive steel door. "You know that thing's been sitting here longer than most people in this valley have been alive." "I know." "And you're planning to open it?" "I have to." He laughed softly. "Most folks would have sold it back for scrap already." Clara rested a hand against the cold metal. "I don't think it's empty." Jedediah stared at her for several seconds. "What makes you believe that—" She couldn't answer. Because she didn't know. It wasn't logic. It wasn't evidence. It was instinct. the kind her father had always trusted whenever he worked metal. "Steel always tells a story," he used to say. "You just have to learn how to listen." After a long silence, the old man nodded. "I've still got my old sledgehammer and a few railroad chisels. If you're stubborn enough to try, I'll help." For the next 4 days, the abandoned rail yard echoed with sounds that hadn't been heard for decades. Clang. Steel against steel. Clang. A shower of rust. Clang. Another tiny crack appeared along the thick weld. The work was brutally exhausting. Jedediah swung the heavy hammer. Clara positioned the chisel with the steady precision her father had taught her years ago beside the forge. Although she could no longer perform the heaviest work herself, she guided every strike, every angle, every adjustment. She understood metal better than anyone expected. Each evening, after the sun disappeared behind the Wyoming mountains, she sharpened the worn chisels beside a small fire. Jedediah watched quietly. "You learned all this from your father." She smiled. "He always said, 'Iron remembers the hands that shape it.'" The old man nodded with respect. "So do people." By the morning of the 5th day, the weld had begun to fracture. A thin black line appeared across the enormous door. Neither of them spoke. One more strike. The sledgehammer rose high into the morning sky, then came crashing down with every ounce of strength Jedediah still possessed. Boom! The weld shattered. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then came a deep metallic groan. The enormous door shifted only an inch. Dust exploded into the sunlight. The air that escaped was unlike anything either of them had ever smelled. Cold. Dry. Ancient. It was the breath of a place untouched for 30 years. Neither moved. It felt wrong somehow, as though disturbing the silence required permission from the dead. After several long minutes, Jedediah lit an old lantern. Together they slowly slid the heavy door open. The rusty wheels screamed across the track. The sound echoed through the empty valley like a cry from another century. The lantern's light pushed back decades of darkness. Wooden crates appeared first, perfectly stacked, still bound with iron straps. Not scattered, not looted, as if someone had expected to return. Then, the light reached the center of the boxcar. Clara stopped breathing. A human skeleton sat slumped against a massive iron strongbox. One bony hand still rested protectively across its lid. His faded railroad uniform had almost disappeared into dust. Only fragments remained. Beside him, lying on the wooden floor, was a leather-bound ledger, untouched. Waiting, Jedediah slowly removed his hat. "My God, he never got out." The entire boxcar fell silent once again. Clara carefully stepped forward, each footfall stirring 30 years of dust into the lantern light. She knelt beside the forgotten man, not as someone searching for treasure, but as someone honoring a stranger who had died protecting something greater than himself. With trembling hands, she picked up the weathered ledger. The cracked leather nearly fell apart beneath her fingers. On the first page was a single name written in elegant handwriting: Paymaster Elias Vance. Below it, payroll records: Wyoming and Pacific Railroad, August 12th, 1855. Clara looked at the skeleton. Then back at the ledger. She had entered the boxcar believing she might find forgotten cargo. Instead, she had just uncovered the first piece of a mystery buried for 3 decades. A mystery powerful enough to expose a betrayal no one had dared imagine. And the greatest shock was still waiting inside the iron strongbox. For several long moments, neither Clara nor Jedediah spoke. The lantern flickered softly inside the forgotten boxcar, its golden light dancing across the silent skeleton. The rows of untouched wooden crates, and the massive iron strongbox that had guarded its secrets for 3 decades. Outside, the Wyoming wind continued to whistle through the abandoned rail yard as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. Clara carefully brushed another layer of dust from the leather-bound ledger before opening it page by page. Inside were hundreds of names. Railroad workers, engineers, stonemasons, track builders, foremen. Every line recorded with remarkable precision. Every paycheck carefully documented. Every signature space left painfully blank. It wasn't simply a payroll book. It was the unfinished story of hundreds of families who had never received the wages they had earned. As Clara continued reading, something slipped from between the brittle pages. A sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. Across the front were 7 haunting words. To whoever finally opens this car. Her heartbeat quickened. Very carefully, she broke the brittle seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. Each line seemed heavier than the last. Elias Vance explained that he had discovered a conspiracy involving senior executives of the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. The payroll shipment had never truly been robbed. The robbery had been staged. Someone inside the company had planned everything. When Elias realized the truth, he refused to hand over the workers' wages. Instead, he locked himself inside the boxcar with the payroll and used portable welding equipment to seal the heavy door from the inside. He knew exactly what that decision meant. He knew no one would come for him. He knew he would never leave alive. But he also knew that if the money disappeared, thousands of honest workers would lose everything they had spent years building. His final sentence nearly stole the breath from Clara's lungs. If these pages are ever found, please make sure the men receive what they earned. Justice delayed is still justice. Tears blurred Clara's vision. She wasn't crying because of the gold. She wasn't crying because of the mystery. She was crying because somewhere, 30 years earlier, a stranger had willingly sacrificed his own life to protect people he would never see again. She looked toward the skeleton resting quietly beside the strongbox. You stayed. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. You stayed so they wouldn't lose hope. Jedediah slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. I worked with men like him. They weren't rich. They built these tracks one spike at a time. They deserved better. Clara carefully unfolded the final page tucked inside the letter. There, written in elegant handwriting, was one name she never expected to see. Gerald Whitmore, Vice President of Land Acquisition. Her uncle. The man who had thrown a pregnant woman onto the street with $10, had built his fortune upon money stolen from hard-working families. For a moment, Clara's entire world seemed to stop. Suddenly, everything made sense. The enormous wealth, the endless land purchases, the bank, the town that carried his family name. None of it had begun with honest success. It had begun with betrayal, with lies, with stolen wages, with one brave man sealed alive inside a railroad boxcar. A wave of anger surged through her. She imagined riding back east, marching into Gerald Whitmore's office, throwing the letter onto his polished desk, watching him finally answer for what he had done. But just as quickly, another voice entered her thoughts. Her father's. When steel is bent the wrong way, you don't fix it by striking harder. You fix it by understanding where its strength truly lies. She closed her eyes, then looked once more at Elias Vance's final request. He had never written, "Punish the guilty." He had written, "Pay the workers." That simple difference changed everything. Clara suddenly realized that revenge would satisfy only one wounded heart. Justice could restore hundreds. She folded the letter with extraordinary care and placed it back inside the ledger. Then she turned toward Jedediah. "We're not going after my uncle." The old railroad worker stared at her in disbelief. "What?" "He deserves prison. He deserves to lose everything." "Maybe. Clara nodded quietly. But that's not what Elias died for. She gently placed one hand over her unborn child. My father spent his whole life building things. He never taught me how to destroy. He taught me how to repair. She looked around the forgotten boxcar. The crates, the strong box, the silent skeleton, the ledger. Everything suddenly had a new meaning. This wasn't buried treasure. It wasn't an opportunity to become rich. It was a debt waiting to be repaid. A promise waiting to be honored. And for the first time since being cast out of her uncle's home, Clara no longer felt like a homeless woman searching for somewhere to survive. She felt like the guardian of someone else's unfinished mission. The frightened young woman who had stepped off the train with only $10 had disappeared. In her place stood a mother preparing to leave her child something far greater than an inheritance. She was about to rebuild something money alone could never buy. Hope. And although she did not yet realize it, that single decision would soon breathe life back into an entire forgotten town. That night, Clara hardly slept. The Wyoming wind rattled the old boarding house as if the forgotten town itself had awakened after 30 years of silence. The lantern burned low beside her bed. The leather-bound ledger remained open on the table. Again and again, her eyes drifted over the names written in Elias Vance's careful handwriting. Every name belonged to a man who had trusted the railroad. Every number represented weeks or months of sweat beneath the blazing summer sun. Every blank signature told the same heartbreaking story. Someone had stolen more than wages. They had stolen dreams. Across the room, Clara rested both hands over her unborn child. The baby moved gently beneath her fingertips. A faint smile crossed her face. "My little one," she whispered. "I thought God brought us here so I could survive." She paused. "I think He brought us here so we could help others survive." For the first time since leaving her uncle's house, Clara no longer asked herself, "How will I live?" Instead, she asked something far more powerful. "How many lives can we rebuild?" The next morning, the sun rose over Caldera Spur with a brilliance the abandoned valley had not seen in years. Clara, Jedediah, and a kind widow named Margaret Hayes, who had lived alone in the valley since her husband passed away, gathered around the heavy iron strongbox once more. Margaret had spent nearly her entire life listening to stories from the old railroad workers. When she finished reading Elias Vance's letter, tears quietly rolled down her weathered cheeks. "I remember these families," she whispered. "My father spoke about them until the day he died. They were never lazy. They were cheated." Silence settled over the room. Finally, Jedediah broke it. "So, what do we do now?" Clara looked at the stacks of gleaming gold coins inside the strongbox. Enough wealth to make any ordinary person rich beyond imagination. Enough money to buy land. A mansion. Businesses. Security for herself and her child. No one would have blamed her for keeping it. After everything she had endured, the world might even have called it justice. But Clara slowly closed the lid. "None of this belongs to me." Margaret looked surprised. "You found it." "No," Clara answered gently. "Elias protected it. I only found where he was waiting." She placed the ledger carefully on the table. "He didn't die so one woman could become wealthy. He died because hundreds of honest families deserved to receive what they had earned." Jedediah nodded slowly. "I think he'd be proud to hear you say that." Clara smiled sadly. "I hope so." Then she pointed to the first name inside the ledger. "Thomas O'Connor. Track foreman? Caldera Spur. Unpaid wages, $180. Margaret's eyes widened. "The O'Connors." She looked toward the eastern hills. "There's still family here. His granddaughter lives about 5 miles away. She's a widow. Raises 2 boys by herself." Clara immediately stood. "Then she's our first stop. By noon, An old wagon carried the three of them across the dusty valley road. The cabin they reached was small, weathered, and barely standing. Its roof sagged under years of neglect. Broken fence posts leaned sideways. The vegetable garden struggled against dry Wyoming soil. Everything about the place spoke of quiet hardship. A woman opened the door. She looked exhausted. Life had etched worry into every line of her face. Two barefoot boys peeked nervously from behind her skirt. "Can I help you?" Clara smiled warmly. "I hope so. My name is Clara Bennett. I've come because your grandfather worked for the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad." The woman's expression changed immediately. "My grandfather? He died believing they'd stolen his wages? My grandmother never forgave them." Clara slowly opened the old ledger. She turned the fragile pages until she found his name. "There he is. Thomas O'Connor." The widow stared at the handwriting. Her hands began to tremble. "I've heard my grandmother describe this. She said someone kept records, but nobody believed her." Clara carefully placed a heavy leather pouch on the kitchen table. It landed with a soft metallic sound. The widow looked confused. "What is this?" Clara pushed the pouch toward her. "Your grandfather's wages. Every dollar, and 30 years of interest." The room became perfectly still. For several seconds, nobody moved. Finally, the widow loosened the leather strings. Dozens of shining gold coins caught the afternoon sunlight. She gasped. Her knees weakened. Tears filled her eyes before she could speak. This can't be real. It is." Clara gently took her hand. "Someone gave his life protecting this money. He wanted your grandfather to receive what he earned. I'm only finishing the promise." The widow suddenly began crying. Not the loud cries of shock, but the quiet tears of someone who had spent years carrying invisible pain. "My grandmother died saying they robbed him. Everyone called her bitter. They said she couldn't let go." She looked at the ledger again. She was telling the truth. The two young boys stepped closer, staring at the gold with wide eyes. They didn't understand the history, but they understood something else. For the first time in their lives, their mother was smiling. Before leaving, Clara asked the widow to sign a simple receipt acknowledging the payment. Jedediah watched curiously. "Why keep records?" Clara closed the ledger carefully. "Because lies were built on paper." She held up the signed receipt. "So the truth must be preserved the same way." As they climbed back into the wagon, Margaret looked towards the small cabin. Smoke now rose gently from its chimney. The boys laughed outside, chasing each other across the yard. It was the first joyful sound the valley had heard in years. Jedediah smiled. "One family?" Clara nodded. "Today," she looked down at the thick ledger resting in her lap. Hundreds of names still remained. Hundreds of families. Hundreds of broken promises waiting to be fulfilled. The journey had only just begun, but somewhere deep inside her heart, Clara understood something that would guide every step from that day forward. She had arrived in Caldera Spur, believing she was searching for a future for her unborn child. Instead, she had been entrusted with restoring the past for an entire generation. And as word of the mysterious young pregnant woman carrying gold and a forgotten ledger quietly spread from one valley to the next, something extraordinary began happening. The town everyone believed had died was slowly beginning to breathe again. By the time Clara returned from the O'Connor cabin, the sun was sinking behind the Wyoming hills. The wagon rolled slowly into Caldera Spur, its wooden wheels creaking over the abandoned road. The old ledger rested across Clara's lap, heavier now than it had been that morning. Not because another name had been crossed off, because for the first time, she had seen what justice looked like on a human face. She could still see Elizabeth O'Connor standing in that dim kitchen, clutching the leather pouch with both hands. She could still hear the disbelief in her voice. The quiet sobs. The broken sentence about her grandmother dying without ever being believed. All those years, the O'Connor family had carried shame that never belonged to them. And with one payment, Clara had returned more than money. She had returned the truth. As the wagon entered the silent rail yard, Clara placed one hand over her belly. The baby moved beneath her coat, and tears suddenly filled her eyes. "I almost kept it," she whispered. Jedediah glanced toward her. "What did you say?" Clara looked down at the ledger. "The gold!" Her voice trembled. "When we opened that strong box, part of me imagined what it could buy." She swallowed hard. "A real house. Warm clothes. A safe place for my child. A doctor when the baby comes." She looked toward the rusted boxcar. For a few seconds, I wanted all of it. Jedediah did not judge her. He simply nodded. "Anyone would have—" Clara's eyes remained fixed on the fading road behind them. But when Elizabeth opened that pouch, I understood something. "What?" Clara wiped a tear from her cheek. "I thought I was the poorest person in the world because I had no home." Her voice softened. But those families lost something deeper. They lost the right to believe their fathers and grandfathers had been honest men. The wagon stopped beside the boxcar. Clara climbed down carefully. But the long journey had left her exhausted. Her legs trembled beneath her. A sharp pain crossed her lower back, and she gripped the side of the wagon. Margaret hurried toward her. "Clara." "I'm all right." "No, you're tired." Margaret placed an arm around her. "You cannot save every family in one day." Clara looked at the ledger. "There are hundreds of names, and there is only one of you." Those words struck harder than Clara expected. For months, she had survived by refusing to appear weak. At Gerald Whitmore's house, weakness had been used against her. On the train, fear had nearly forced her to keep moving. At Caldera Spur, she had worked through swollen feet, sleepless nights, and the constant terror of bringing a child into a world where she owned almost nothing. But standing between Margaret and Jedediah, Clara finally allowed herself to stop pretending. "I'm scared," she confessed. The words came out as a whisper. Then the rest poured free. "I'm scared the gold won't be enough. I'm scared we won't find all the families. I'm scared Gerald will learn what we discovered." Her hand tightened over her stomach. "And I'm terrified that when this baby comes, I won't know how to protect her." Margaret pulled Clara into her arms. For one stunned second, Clara stood rigid. Then she broke. She buried her face against the older woman's shoulder and cried with all the pain she had carried since the night her uncle cast her out. She cried for her father, for Elias Vance, for the workers who died waiting, for every night she had gone hungry while pretending she was strong enough. Jedediah turned away, quietly removing his hat. Margaret held her more tightly. "You listen to me," she whispered. "Being afraid does not make you weak." Clara's shoulders shook. "It means you understand what you could lose." The baby kicked between them. Margaret smiled through her own tears. "And that child will not enter this world alone." Clara lifted her head. Margaret nodded toward the town. "Neither will you." The next morning, something changed. Clara no longer tried to carry the mission by herself. Jedediah began locating former railroad families. Margaret organized receipts, meals, and sleeping arrangements. Elizabeth O'Connor arrived with her 2 sons and offered to repair the old boarding house. Within days, other families came. Some brought tools, some brought lumber. Some had nothing except willing hands. Caldera Spur began to stir. Hammers rang against wood. Smoke rose from chimneys that had been cold for years. Children cleared weeds from the old road. The abandoned blacksmith shop reopened, and each strike of iron reminded Clara of her father. For the first time, she understood his greatest lesson. Strength was not standing alone. Strength was allowing others to stand beside you. Weeks earlier, Clara had arrived as a frightened pregnant woman with $6, one suitcase, and nowhere to belong. Now, people waited outside the boxcar each morning not for gold alone, but for guidance, for hope, for proof that the past did not have to control the future. And as Clara opened the ledger to the next unpaid name, she realized she was no longer simply protecting her unborn child. She was becoming the kind of mother who could teach that child something far more valuable than wealth. That even a life shattered by cruelty could be rebuilt through courage, truth, and the hands of people who refused to let one another fall. Autumn settled gently over Caldera Spur. The rolling Wyoming hills shimmered beneath blankets of golden grass, while crisp mountain air carried the comforting scent of burning firewood through streets that had once known only silence. Looking across the valley, it was almost impossible to believe this had ever been a forgotten ghost town. Only months ago, abandoned buildings leaned toward collapse. Today, smoke rose from nearly every chimney. Children chased one another between freshly painted fences. The blacksmith's forge rang from sunrise until sunset. Storefront windows reflected smiling faces instead of broken glass. Hope had returned, not because someone had discovered hidden gold, but because one woman had refused to believe that wealth belonged to the person who found it. She believed it belonged to the people who had earned it. Standing outside the weathered railroad boxcar, Clara rested one hand against the wooden railing, while the other instinctively covered her swollen belly. A sharp contraction tightened across her back. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before forcing herself to smile. Margaret noticed immediately. "That one was stronger." "I know," Clara answered quietly. "You should be resting." "I will." She glanced toward the growing line of families waiting outside her office. "Shamar." "After I finish today's names." Margaret sighed. "You've become as stubborn as your father must have been." Clara laughed softly. "Probably." Before either woman could say another word, excited footsteps echoed across the rail yard. "Miss Clara." Little Ben O'Connor came running as fast as his legs would carry him, waving a folded newspaper high above his head. "They wrote about you." Breathing hard, he handed her the paper. Across the front page, bold black letters stretched from one side to the other. "Mysterious young woman restores stolen railroad wages after 30 years." Clara stared at the headline. Slowly, she began reading. The article never mentioned treasure. It never spoke about gold or fortune. Instead, it told the stories of railroad workers whose names had finally been cleared. It described widows receiving long overdue wages, families rebuilding abandoned homes, neighbors helping strangers as though they had always belonged to one another. Exactly the story Elias Vance had hoped the world would someday hear. Clara folded the newspaper carefully. Ben grinned. "You're famous." She smiled and shook her head. "No. The workers are... They waited 30 years for someone to tell the truth." Word spread faster than anyone expected. Within days, wagons began arriving from neighboring counties. Some families carried faded photographs. Others brought old letters their grandparents had saved for decades. Many weren't hoping to receive money anymore. Most simply wanted answers. They wanted anyone to finally say the words history had denied them. "Your father wasn't a thief. Your grandfather wasn't forgotten. Your family deserved better." For 3 days and 3 nights, Clara, Margaret, Jedediah, and dozens of volunteers searched through Elias Vance's records. Every confirmed signature healed another family. Every payment erased another generation of doubt. Some people cried openly. Others stood in stunned silence. Many simply embraced one another, overwhelmed that justice had finally found its way home. Then, early on the 4th morning, the peaceful rhythm of the town was interrupted. The distant sound of horses echoed across the valley. Heads turned. Children stopped playing. The ringing hammers inside the forge fell silent. A stagecoach rolled slowly into Caldera Spur, surrounded by armed deputies. Sheriff William Carter climbed down first. Behind him, a second figure appeared, wearing an expensive black coat that now looked strangely out of place among ordinary working people. Gerald Whitmore stepped onto the dusty street. For the first time since throwing his pregnant niece out of his mansion, he stood before her again. Months earlier, Clara had faced him alone. Now, an entire town stood quietly behind her. Gerald looked older. His shoulders had lost their pride. The confidence that once filled every word had vanished. Sheriff Carter held up the weathered payroll ledger. Miss Bennett, this book confirms fraud, theft, conspiracy, and the disappearance of Elias Vance. He looked toward Gerald. We've been searching for the truth for years. Now we finally have it. Gerald's eyes met Clara's. For several painful seconds, neither spoke. Finally, his voice broke. I never believed anyone would find that boxcar. No, Clara answered calmly. You made certain no one would. He lowered his head. I wanted success. I convinced myself everyone would eventually forget. His eyes wandered across the rebuilt homes. The children, the families, the forge, the laughter, everything his greed had nearly destroyed. I was wrong. Silence settled over the crowd. Many expected Clara to shout. Others hoped she would finally release the anger she had carried for so long. Instead, she slowly walked toward her uncle. Every careful step reminded everyone that she was only days away from becoming a mother. When she finally stopped in front of him, her voice remained calm. You didn't only steal money. You stole fathers from their children. You stole dignity from honest families. You stole 30 years that no one can ever return. Gerald closed his eyes. I know. Then Clara said something no one expected. I forgave you. She paused, tears filling her eyes. Ah, the day I stopped allowing your choices to define my future. Gerald looked up in disbelief. She continued quietly. If I spent my life hating you, you would still control it. I refuse to give you that power. Tears rolled down Gerald's face. Not because deputies stood beside him, not because prison awaited, but because the frightened young woman he had once dismissed as weak had become stronger than he could ever hope to be. The deputies stepped forward. Without resistance, Gerald offered his hands. As the stagecoach disappeared beyond the valley, nobody cheered. There was no celebration. Justice did not need applause. It simply needed truth. That evening, the people of Caldera Spur gathered outside the old railroad boxcar. Long wooden tables stretched beneath lanterns hanging from freshly repaired beams. Fresh bread, roasted vegetables, steaming stew, homemade pies. Musicians played old railroad melodies while children danced barefoot beneath the stars. For the first time in decades, the town wasn't merely surviving. It was living. As laughter filled the night air, Clara suddenly stopped smiling. Another contraction seized her. This one stronger than all the rest. Margaret looked at her only once before standing. It's time. Within minutes, the women gently guided Clara inside the same railroad boxcar that had once held betrayal, sacrifice, and 30 years of silence. Outside, no one went home. Neighbors lit lanterns. Men built up the fire. Children whispered prayers they barely understood. Hours passed. The entire town waited together. Just before dawn, a baby's cry broke the silence. Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward the weathered boxcar, the place where one brave man had given his life protecting hope, had now become the place where a new life entered the world. Margaret stepped onto the porch with tears shining in her eyes. It's a little girl." The valley erupted with joyful applause. Inside, Clara cradled her newborn daughter against her chest. The old payroll ledger rested quietly on the table beside Elias Vance's final letter. She gently kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered, "My sweet girl, never measure your life by what you own. Measure it by the lives that are better because you were here." Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight stretched across the railroad tracks, bathing the valley in warm golden light. Those rails had once carried greed, betrayal, and broken promises. Now, they carried something far greater, a legacy of courage, a legacy of truth, and the timeless reminder that even the deepest wounds can become the foundation for a future filled with hope. Clara Bennett never set out to become a hero. She was simply a frightened young woman, 7 months pregnant, carrying one small suitcase and the pain of being abandoned by the only family she thought she had left. When she stepped off that train with just a few dollars in her pocket, the world saw someone who had lost everything. But life has a remarkable way of hiding its greatest blessings inside its hardest moments. If Clara had chosen comfort instead of courage, she never would have discovered the forgotten boxcar. If she had chosen anger instead of compassion, hundreds of families would have remained trapped beneath the weight of a lie. If she had chosen wealth instead of integrity, an entire town would never have been given a second chance. Her story reminds us that true success is not measured by the size of a bank account or the possessions we leave behind. It is measured by the number of lives we lift, the promises we keep, and the kindness we choose when no one is watching. Every one of us will face moments when life feels unfair. We will experience betrayal, disappointment, and loss. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can always choose what kind of person those hardships will shape us into. Sometimes, the greatest legacy we leave our children is not money or property. It is our character. It is our honesty. It is the courage to do what is right, even when no one else does. Long after wealth disappears and names are forgotten, acts of compassion continue to echo through generations. That is the kind of inheritance that never loses its value. Call to action. If Clara's journey touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on someone who helped shape your life through kindness, honesty, or sacrifice. Share their story in the comments below. We would love to read it. And your words may inspire someone who needs hope today. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring journey. And remember, sometimes the smallest act of courage can become the beginning of someone else's miracle. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.